I have the great joy of introducing two fabulous colleagues of mine, um, both on the faculty at St. Vladimir's. Uh, Dr. Michael Legaspi is our associate professor of Old Testament. He teaches courses in scripture, philosophy, and biblical Hebrew. His chief interests are in the history of biblical interpretation and the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. And apart from two major books published with Oxford University Press, he is currently working on a commentary on the book of Job, which I think will set us up very nicely for the theme of the first conversation, which has to do with suffering. Father George Parsenios, pastor of St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church in Lexington, Massachusetts, is professor of New Testament at Holy Cross, Greek Orthodox School of Theology, where he has also served as academic dean. As I say, he also remains on our faculty at St. Vladimir's, I'm happy to say. And his research focuses on the interaction of early Christianity with the classical world. And he's the author of 3 books and several essays on New Testament themes. And the theme of this morning's inaugural conversation is Scriptural Perspectives on Suffering. Thank you both for being with us, and I look forward so much to hearing your conversation.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for leading us in prayer. It is wonderful to be with you all on this Ed Day, this important day in the life of the seminary. I am honored today to share this opportunity, as Peter mentioned, with Father George Parsenios, a scholar of the New Testament. So, Father George, I think I'm as eager to hear from you as everyone else is. So welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Good to be with you.
Okay, very good. So just a quick word about format for our hour together. We'll be talking about suffering, a phrase that comes to me from my childhood, hearing my mom pray the Salve Regina. Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To thee do we cry, poor banished children of Eve. To thee do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. And I remember hearing this prayer and thinking, oh, my mom is really going through it. Something about those words sort of cut through appearances, cut through the fog of everyday life. And there's something, it evokes, I think, something real and important about kind of the quality and the nature of our life on earth. What do we do in this valley of tears? How do we respond to being in it? What does it mean? With so many things, right, in our lives, we turn to Scripture for encouragement, for illumination, for perspective. I'm going to be speaking briefly 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so on the Old Testament. And then Father George will talk about scriptural perspectives on suffering from the New Testament side. And then we're hoping to have about 10, 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions, you are welcome to put them in the Q&A function of the chat, and we'll do our best to get to those and discuss those at the end. Okay, great. So the Old Testament has a very rich vocabulary of suffering. God humbles, afflicts, punishes, abases, destroys, visits, smites, touches. People kill, beat, crush, pursue, mock, rise up, oppress. Our bodies feel pain, hunger, thirst, weariness, illness, weakness. Our soul feels vexation, hopelessness, despair, sorrow. We have all of these words that give us this sort of rich vocabulary. But what I was noticing as I was thinking about our conversation today is that there's actually no general word for suffering like we have in English. There's no kind of general category for it in the Old Testament that I could find, which led me to sort of realize that there isn't really a general theory of suffering, right? So we're kind of inclined to maybe think about it in terms of a category, a thing that we can theorize and reflect on in this general way. But I think in the Old Testament, suffering is just taken for granted, right? It's not theorized. And when people think of, so we can sort of turn to the particular examples of Scripture. And when people think of suffering, they think of Job. As Peter mentioned, I am working on a commentary on the book of Job. And so what I'm planning to do today is just to share some thoughts on suffering, inspired by things I've been reading and working on in Job. So the first point I think I'd like to make is that when it comes to suffering, we are inclined to ask the question, why? Why do people suffer? Why do I suffer, right? Why is my loved one suffering? But what I think is actually kind of more the question, at least in the book of Job, is not why do people suffer, but what now, right? Not why, but what now? I mean, obviously, these are related questions, right? So why you're suffering informs how you respond to it. But I do think there's a difference in the two questions. One, we might call sort of philosophical, but the kind of what now question is very practical. And that is what I'm seeing is actually really important to understanding the book of Job, is that it's about the response. So the story of Job is, I think, very, very familiar. Kind of looking at it anew has been eye-opening for me. Having reached midlife myself, you know, I open the book of Job and I find, what do we have? We have a man very much in midlife. Okay. Job, however, is perfect in virtue. So very much unlike me, right? He's perfect in virtue. And then he suffers what can only be described as a kind of unimaginable catastrophe, suffering in every way possible, happening very suddenly in a very extreme way. So we might hear about this, read this in just the very first chapter, really, of the book of Job and think, why? And the book of Job is just very clear, right? The first chapter gives you the answer to that question. Satan wanted to test Job, and God allowed the test to take place. So it kind of takes care of the why question already just in the first chapter. But the book is not one chapter, it's 42. So there's a lot more to the book than just the bare kind of event itself. So most of the book of Job is actually this dialogue, right? We think of Job, you remember the story. This is a man of perfect virtue who was plunged into suffering by God and then endured and was restored in the end. But actually, the heart of the book of Job is this dialogue that Job has with his friends, right? So Job talks with three friends who come to him. And this is the part of the book we tend to sort of skip or think is like super repetitive. But this is really where the book wrestles with the what now question, the what now question. So after Job has sort of fallen, his children have died, his livestock have been taken away, his home is destroyed, his position in society is taken from him, his body is beset with illness and disease. The book of Job tells us that he does a very particular thing. He leaves the city and he goes out and sits among the ashes. The Greek version says that he sits on the dunghill, right? So I think this is an important detail because Job is obviously, you know, beset with boils. He's not really in a position to be part of society in any kind of conventional way. So what does he do? He leaves and he goes to the dunghill. And the reason I think this is significant is because it's not part of society, but it's also not part of society, right? So it's this sort of peripheral position. So Job, in a way, is suffering in a way that's public. And the church fathers actually are keen to point this out, that when Job goes to the dunghill, God is putting him on display. And I think that's an important aspect of suffering, is that when we suffer, we don't suffer completely alone, right? Our suffering takes place in front of other people. And so when we suffer, we're bearing witness to something, right? Whether good or bad. But there's that kind of spectacle aspect to it. So the friends basically are responding to this question, what should Job do now? And they have a very clear idea. They see Job sitting there in filth, covered in boils, and they say, leave, get up, approach God as a suppliant. Job, you've had a setback, right? You know, this isn't really what you wanted. You've had a setback, but you have a very bright future in front of you. At destruction and famine, you will laugh. You will know that your tent is safe. Your descendants will be many. God will fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouts of joy. You'll forget your misery. Remember it as waters that pass away. Your life will be brighter than the noonday. Your darkness will be like morning. They give Job all these promises of a bigger and brighter future. And their impulse is to get him to kind of move on, right, from what's happened and from where he is, leave the dunghill and supplicate God. So when we think about our responses to suffering, the kind of what now question, we can see and maybe learn from Job two things, two elements to a response to suffering. The first thing is that Job stays in place. So this is the argument in the book. Get up, Job, leave the dunghill. And Job says, I'm going to stay. I'm not leaving. And instead of being focused on the future, the way the friends want him to be, Job is like fixed on the present moment in this very intense way. And some of the things that he says are pretty strong. The arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. My flesh is clothed with worms and dirt. My skin hardens and breaks out. My days pass swiftly. God wears me out. God has shriveled me up, torn me in his wrath, treated me like an enemy. I was at ease and he broke me, seized me by the neck and dashed me in pieces. His archers surround me, pierce my kidneys, pour my gall on the ground. He breaks on me, breach on breach, like a warrior, and so on, right? So these are very strong complaints, and people take this as sort of Job like protesting, rebelling against God. But I think there's something deeper going on here, right? And what I want us to notice is how attentive Job is to what God is doing to him. Now, he experiences it as enmity, right? It's very difficult, right? But he's very attentive also to the things that are happening to him. God is piercing him, breaking him open, and emptying him in his experience on the dunghill. So the first thing is stay in place. And the second thing is wait, right? The friends want him to get up, supplicate, and move on and have a happy life. But he can't do that. His sufferings have changed him. And I think that's the other aspect of suffering, is that we don't just go through them and then, brush them off. They change us. And so Job can't do what they're saying because his sufferings have changed who he is and his understanding of what it would mean to be whole again. And what they're offering doesn't match that at all. He realizes he's helpless. And the more he complains, the more he realizes that God is doing something to him that he doesn't understand. So one of the things that I've noticed in Job is that there seems to be like this language barrier between God and Job. God is doing things to Job on the dunghill that he doesn't quite understand. And there's kind of a language barrier. He can't quite figure it out. And so he cries out on numerous occasions for help, basically, for an intermediary. He speaks of an arbiter to lay his hand on God and him so that he can speak to God without fear. He speaks of a witness in heaven who can explain to God what's happening from Job's perspective. He talks about a redeemer. He says, I know that my redeemer lives. At the last, he will stand upon the earth after my skin has been destroyed. From my flesh, I shall see God, whom I shall see on my side. My eyes shall behold and not another. So stay in place, wait. And what he sees in this is his need basically for an intermediary, a redeemer, someone who can break that kind of language barrier, right? So we're suffering, we're supposed to be learning and hearing, but we are kind of our own impediment in a lot of ways. So just sort of wrapping up this like brief look at the book of Job, what's the point really of Job's sufferings? Okay, so we come to the end of the book and we find that God comes to Job and appears to him, right? So Job's sufferings on the dunghill have prepared him essentially to see God. And the miracle of the book of Job is that God comes to the dunghill. This place that the friends hated and wanted him to forsake is where God comes to Job and addresses him. So the friends see God as sort of this gracious patron that you should turn to for help. But Job sees him as the one who comes down and meets us in the valley of tears, meets us on the dunghill. So I think Job is prepared to see God through his suffering. It's his sufferings that prepare him. God empties Job out. He hollows him out so that he can see the world anew. And it's only then that Job leaves. He repents and leaves the dunghill. So God has put him there and God has taken him off. So this is different from the friend's response of get up and move yourself, right? suffering happens. God wills it for us. It's impossible to avoid. On the one hand, we have the friends as an example of what not to do. Get up, move, make it better. And then on the other side, you have Job, who gives us a different example, right? Pay attention to what's happening in the sufferings, stay in place, and wait for God to come. So just a very kind of probably scandalous simplification of the book of Job, but just something maybe for us to think about as we're trying to have this, conversation on suffering. So, Father George, I invite you to, I know that you've got, coming to this from the New Testament side, have things to say as well. So please, Father George.
Father Mike, or Dr. Legaspi, thank you very, very, I just promoted you. Or
Yes.
maybe, well, who knows, maybe demoted you, depending on your perception. But thank you very, very much. I think I also, when we were beginning, let me just pause for a second. I think I missed my cue from you to say just a few introductory things.
Sure.
And I just want to express my great gratitude to Sarah Werner for putting this all together, Dr. Butenev for arranging it, Father Chad for being the foundation for it, and especially for being able to participate in St. Vladimir's Education Day. I remember years ago when it was a live event and everyone would come for the books and the food and to hear the wonderful lectures. And it's a joy now to be giving one of those lectures, especially with someone of your caliber as a scholar. So I'm delighted to be paired with you in this. And am also delighted at how what you have said is helpful in preparation for what I want to say. When you talked about Job being hollowed out, when you talked about the language barrier between God and Job, it's beautiful to think of there being this problem where God can't, or where Job is trying to find a way to for God to contact him. And of course, that happens in Jesus Christ. I'm going to talk about suffering in similar ways, but as you said, through the New Testament. And the dilemma of suffering is really a profound one for us. And there's a particular problem in even the way we pray, because we begin all our services by praying for peace, for the peace of the whole world, the stability of the holy churches of God, that we have a bounty of the fruits of the earth and all these things. And yet at the same time, we're told that we must carry the cross of Christ. So at the same time that we're asking God to fill our lives with blessing and abundance and calm and peace, we're also told to carry the cross. And there's a question there about how those two things go together and what it means to carry the cross in the love of God and as part of what God wants for us. And to explain that and to reflect on that, I want to go back to the Apostle Paul, who in his second letter to the Corinthians begs God to remove a thorn in his flesh. And in response, he hears only, "My strength is made perfect in weakness." It's a powerful phrase from 2 Corinthians. My strength is made perfect in weakness. And I'd like to reflect on this phrase from a couple of different perspectives. First, a more superficial one, sort of philosophical perspective. And then second, a rhetorical perspective, because the words strength and weakness have a prominent place in Paul's dealings with the Corinthians, both in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And then finally, from a theological perspective, to see how it is that we live the resurrection by carrying the cross, and that therefore the strength of God is shown in our weakness. Before I do that, let me just say two things about the problem in the second letter to the Corinthians. This is the most personal of Paul's letters. In other letters, like the letter to the Galatians, there's a theological or doctrinal problem. The Galatians are leaving the faith, and Paul addresses them on a theological level. 2 Corinthians is different. Here, it's Paul's personality, Paul's personal dealings with the Corinthians that's at stake, because the false teachers here don't oppose Paul's teaching. They oppose Paul. They claim to be eloquent orators. They claim to have many missionary successes. They claim to have all kinds of ecstatic experiences to impress the Corinthians. But when Paul refers to his own ecstatic experience, It's that phrase that I just quoted to you. He was told by God, my strength is made perfect in weakness. The Corinthian church is full of recent converts who are competing with one another to see who has the greatest knowledge, who has more spiritual gifts. They think those with more money deserve a higher place in the spiritual life of the church. And it's a highly stratified, very competitive church. And Paul says to them, not, I'm going to participate in your competitive activities. I'm going to be impressive the way you want me to be impressive. He says, rather, my strength is made perfect in weakness. Let's look at this first from the philosophical perspective. As early as Herodotus, as far back in Greek literature as we can go, we hear that suffering tells us the measure of a man. Epictetus says that it is difficulties that show what men are, and that suffering is the test of the philosopher. In other words, a philosopher shows that he's not just all talk, not just a lot of words, if he can actually endure the sufferings of life with equanimity and endure the sufferings of life and maintain his philosophical composure. And very often, philosophers will list their sufferings. Diachrysostom will say, many and mighty antagonists I have vanquished, not like these slaves who are now wrestling here. He's at an athletic competition, not like these slaves who are now wrestling here, hurling the discus and running, but more difficult in every way. I mean poverty, exile, and disrepute. Yes, and anger, pain, desire, fear. And then he adds, the most redoubtable beast of all, pleasure. And philosophers would list their sufferings like this to show what they had conquered, because suffering was seen by them to have an educative function. There's one scholar of early Christianity named Stanley Stowers who says that the philosophers of the first century are in a competition for disinterestedness. They're competing with each other to see which one of them can hate the things of the world more. And so we get these wonderful quotations. I actually quote these every time I talk. So it's embarrassing to do it again, but what the heck. You get Diogenes the cynic, who's sitting by the side of the road eating lettuce. And it's said that Plato walks past him and says, Diogenes, I'm going up to the house of the king to dine sumptuously. If you would learn to flatter the king, you wouldn't have to sit here eating lettuce. And Diogenes says, if you would learn to eat lettuce, you wouldn't have to debase yourself by flattering the king, right? So they endure their sufferings to show their virtues. And so for a person newly setting out on the path of philosophy, suffering has an educative function. For the sage, for the person who's reached the pinnacle, their sufferings show what they have already reached. And so St. Paul lists his suffering. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 4, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We are fools for Christ's sake. We are weak. There's those words again. We are weak, but you are strong. You are honored. We are dishonored. To this very hour, we are hungry and thirsty. We are in rags. We are brutally treated. We are homeless, right? And then he says, when persecuted, we endure. When reviled, we bless. And so the Corinthians, as I just said a minute ago, are a highly competitive church. And 1 Corinthians opens with them saying, I am of Apollos, I am of Paul. And they're trying to attach themselves to apostles. But they're doing it by competing on a worldly level. And so at the most basic level, Paul is saying, look, if you want to follow an apostle, you're not doing it right. When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. And so his suffering shows an otherworldliness. And his suffering shows a sort of, in the same way that it did with the philosophers, the things that he has endured to reach this pinnacle. So at the most basic level, we just want to say that for Paul, suffering is a way of showing that he is no longer a slave to the things of the world. He's urging the Corinthians to be less so. And at the most basic level, this is how we can understand my strength is made perfect in weakness. But there's much more than this, because as I said, the words strength and weakness are prominent in the Pauline letters to the first and second letters to the Corinthians. And they're common in antiquity. The weak and the strong are equivalent to what we would say today are the haves and the have-nots. And they're very commonly used. And in such a highly stratified society like the first century of the Roman Empire, the weak were supposed to know their place, and the strong were allowed to enjoy what they could. And we know this from all sorts of fables that circulate in popular literature, where you hear of a turtle that wishes it could fly, and an eagle comes down, a mighty eagle, and picks it up and says, "Oh, you want to fly?" And he takes it up and leaves it on a mountain where the turtle is left to die. And the turtle says, "I should have known better than to rise above my station." And the eagle says, "That's right. You should have stayed where you belong. This is for the birds up here," right? And so this is just an expression on a very popular level to show just how pervasive it is that the weak are below and the strong are above. The problem is that for St. Paul, that is a worldly standard. And he begins 1 Corinthians by saying, the wisdom of God is wiser than the world. The foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of the world. And when you follow the wisdom of God, you look foolish in the world. And so not only is it a virtue to be the weak, but God has taken the weak in order to shame the strong. And the Corinthians themselves are proof of this. He says to them, look at your own call, brethren. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were strong, but God chose what is weak to shame the strong. And so this language of weak and strong is used to show this cosmic reversal that has been accomplished when God takes on flesh and is crucified for our salvation. And this is why St. Paul says all through 2 Corinthians, if I must boast, I will boast of what shows my weakness. He says, you desire in 2 Corinthians, you desire proof that Christ is speaking with me. For he was crucified in weakness, but lives by the strength of God. For we are weak in him, but in dealing with you, we shall live with him by the strength of God. And so the words weak and strong show the cosmic reversal that happens when the God of all, the creator, enters his creation and is crucified in order to overturn the structures of the world and to remake the world. This cosmic reversal then is expressed through the language of the weak and the strong. And so we have to recognize then that St. Paul's life is a life of immense suffering, immense suffering. He says, 5 times I have received the 40 lashes less 1. 3 times I've been beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. I've been shipwrecked. I've been adrift at sea on frequent journeys in danger from Gentiles, dangers in the city. And apart from other things, I have the daily pressure of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak? And I am not weak. And that immense suffering is not understood by him, however, as suffering. And this is where we'll get now to the final stage in our exploration of this passage, the theological one. And this is where we'll return to what Dr. Legaspi discussed about Job being hollowed out. The other New Testament authors, when they talk about the current life that we endure as we anticipate the blessings of the Lord, they'll call this suffering or affliction. 1 Peter 1 says, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while you may have to suffer, so that the genuineness of your faith may redound to praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. In other words, you suffer now in anticipation of future glory. St. Paul sometimes calls this trial suffering, but more often than not, he calls it dying. In Romans 8, he quotes the Psalm when he says, for your sake we are being killed all day long. And then in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, I die every day. And the passage is often mistranslated to say, I face death every day, or I am threatened by death every day. But he says, apothnisko kathimeran, I die every day. And in 2 Corinthians, he uses the confusing phrase that he suffers many deaths, many deaths. And the only way to understand this language is to understand it in the light of what St. Paul says in his letter to the Galatians, when he announces, I bear on my body the marks of Christ. And on the one hand, these marks are the beatings and the wounds from his suffering that we just mentioned a few minutes ago. He's wounded. He has scars on his body. And on another level, these scars show that he's a slave of Christ, right? A slave in antiquity, just like in many times in the modern world, would have been branded or marked somehow with a collar or something to show that it was a slave belonging to a certain person. Well, the scars on St. Paul's body mark him out as a slave of Christ, but they do even more than this, and they are part of his death. He says also in Galatians, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the suffering that is marked on his body is the sign of him being crucified together with Christ. St. Paul insists that we are in Christ and Christ is in us, and that what we live in the body, we live in union with Christ. This is why he insists that non-believing spouses are sanctified by their believing spouses, right? Because the two have become one flesh. And if one of them is sanctified as part of the body of Christ, the other very likely could be. This is why he's also so anxious about sexual immorality and is so careful in telling people to avoid it. And for him, sexual immorality would be anything outside of a man and woman in marriage. And so he's so careful about that, because when you join yourself to someone in that immoral way, you're joining Christ in that immorality. And so there's a bodily fusion between the believer and Christ. And it's a real bodily, corporeal reality for St. Paul. He says in 2 Corinthians, we carry around in our body the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. And so the suffering that he's enduring is a crucifixion that removes from him everything that ties him to this world, everything that separates him from Christ, so that the resurrection can shine through. He is, to use Dr. Legaspi's phrase, his suffering hollows him out, so that there's room for the resurrection to shine through in him, so that he can say, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And so again, in 2 Corinthians 4, we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. Later in 2 Corinthians, he was crucified in weakness, but lives by the strength of God. For we are weak in him, but we live with him by the strength of God. And this is what he means then by saying, my strength is made perfect in weakness. What he's saying is the light of the resurrection shines through my dying. And so what appears to be suffering and weakness to the world around him is actually the strength of God. And in the same way that the foolishness of God, that God enters the world and is weak and is crucified, in the same way that that looks like weakness and foolishness, but is actually the salvation of the world, so too the weakness that looks like Paul's humiliation and his irrelevance is actually a sign of the resurrection shining through him. And this is where his opponents in 2 Corinthians go wrong, because they think that the strength of God shines through in the power of their rhetoric. They think the strength of God shines through in their ecstatic experiences, in their missionary successes. And St. Paul insists, no, the strength of God is shown in weakness. I think that's where I'll stop. I hope I didn't go too over time.
No, not at all. Wow. Thank you so much, Father George. Wow. So profound. I'm thinking about the connection that you're making between suffering and a kind of deathward orientation, right? We don't think of suffering as necessarily having this deathward orientation. We sort of see it as this kind of suffering over here and this kind of suffering over here, and we treat it as, in a sort of disjointed way. But I'm wondering if you think well, just to tie it to Job real quick,
Yeah.
it's really kind of remarkable how often his reports of his own sufferings go kind of just so naturally and easily to some kind of meditation on death. It happens in so many of his speeches. It just, here, this is how I feel, this is what's happening, and then some kind of, and of course his reflections on death change, and they're not, they're a little confused. There's a kind of obscurity to them, but it does, that connection does seem to be there. So I'm just wondering if I am kind of catching you right here,
Yeah.
connecting the two.
That's fantastic. I'll like to look at that, and I'd like to see how you develop that. It reminds me of, and I'm going to quote, I'm not going to be able to quote where I heard this, but someone said that every form of loss in this life is an exercise in learning how to die. So, and I think of that, and this is sort of, the sort of the bittersweet reality of children growing up and moving away. It's, they have to do that, but there's a loss there. And it's an exercise in realizing that nothing here is going to last the way we want it to or the way it is. And all of those forms of loss, even something like that, that's a little bit bitter, but is also sweet, is a form of letting go, a form of not grasping and holding on to the things of this life. As good as they are and as blessed as they are. I don't want to veer off into a whole nother kind of problem. But yeah, I think so. It's that the relationship of suffering and death is, I think, something that could be contemplated endlessly. Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, well, this is very helpful just to me as I'm trying to think about the book of Job. So thank you so much, Father George. Well, let's see. I think there are some questions. Yes, Peter?
I was going to moderate some of the questions.
Please.
There's a lot of very serious engagement on the part of your listeners. No surprise because of the importance of the theme and because of how you both are handling it so beautifully. A couple of people have remarked the sort of the Christological implications of Job suffering on a dunghill. Christ suffers outside the city on the hill of the skull. And one person just comments, one way I've heard this explained to me is Job is not about theodicy, but about theophany. And then there's a question, why did God have to test Job through suffering? That's one question. And a related question is, why does God act upon the words of Satan?
Wow.
Who is Satan to be listened to?
Right. Very good.
And then there's other questions directed more to Father George.
Great. So in the book of Job, Satan, he's actually called the Satan, right? He has the definite article in front of his name, which suggests that he serves a kind of role. And he is a creature very much under God's control, right? Who he can't do whatever he wants. He comes, he has to report to God. God says, "Where have you been? Walking to and fro in the earth. And have you considered my servant Job?" And then, of course, Job, or the Satan, accuses Job of serving God in a self-interested way. And God doesn't dismiss the accusation. He doesn't stick up for Job. He doesn't say, "Oh, no, you don't understand. Job is actually, a great guy, etc." No, he allows the test to go forward, and he gives the Satan the role of testing him. So I think that the church fathers, in commenting on this, are think that this is actually a really important aspect of the book, because in our own lives, we know we are harried by Satan. We're harried by the demons. They're a kind of part of living on the earth. And the book of Job puts all of that in perspective, right? Nothing is happening to us that we can't bear, that's aside from God's permission. Nothing is happening apart from his will. So instead of, I think the book of Job is saying not so much that, oh, God is out there listening to Satan. It's more like God is out there limiting him and using Satan for his own purposes, right? I think that's more what the book of Job is saying. Why did he have to test Job? I guess I wouldn't say he had to. I don't think there's anything God has to do in the sense of, necessity. I think what Job was given was an opportunity, to be brought into communion with God. And the way that was going to work for Job was through what happened to him, through his sufferings, through his time on the dunghill. That's what had to happen for Job. We don't know why, but this is the path that he needed to take. So it was more about Job needing the testing than God needing to test him. This was what was required for Job to be purified, essentially, because the end, his reward, is to see God. And Saint Isaac the Syrian says, "Vision is consolation." In what form does the consolation of God come? It comes in the form of the vision of God, right? So vision is consolation. So Job is consoled by God when God appears to him, but Job has to be prepared for that. He can't just step out of his house one morning and just, that's going to happen. He has to be prepared. And for whatever reason, this was the way Job was prepared. And I'm not saying all of this happens to all of us, but I would say what does happen to all of us is a path that's appropriate for us in God's judgment, right? About what is needed to bring us to salvation. So I guess that's what I would say.
Wow.
One person just put in a comment, I was in an accident 2 years ago and I'm still learning to walk. I get Job. God says, I'm God and you're not. Get over it. There's a question that I hear kind of relating to what Father George highlighted from St. Paul on asking God to remove the thorn in his flesh. It says, my strength is made perfect in weakness. And so there's a question, is the problem of suffering primarily an issue of the passions? What is the role of our passions in the suffering that comes? And is there something to God kind of waking us from our slumber here?
Yeah. So the thorn in the flesh is a puzzle exegetically. It's difficult to know what it is. Some have speculated that Paul suffered from something like epilepsy. Others wonder if it is some sort of a passion that troubles him. There's a tradition going back as early as St. John Chrysostom, though, that I think is correct, that the thorn in his flesh is his opponents. They're the thorn in the flesh, because the way some of the verbs that he uses to discuss the way that they're buffeting him are words that he uses elsewhere for people who are troubling other people. And one can't be sure the way that you could be sure that 2 + 2 is 4, but I think that's what it is. But the larger question is one that I think needs to be contextualized by seeing that I don't think there's one answer to why people suffer. And I think if we try to talk like that, it can become actually very dangerous. There's another Pauline phrase that God will not test you beyond what you can bear. And if you tell that to some people who are enduring things that feel as though they're beyond bearing, they'll now be suffering. And then they'll also think, oh, now I also don't have good faith because I don't seem to be able to bear this, right? So I'm going to employ the Pauline expression that he became all things to all people, which becomes very important in the Church Fathers to discuss pastoral care, because they use it to build on for medical imagery, right? That Paul here is acting like a doctor who first diagnoses a problem and then addresses it. And no two diseases are the same. No two stages of a disease are the same. And St. John Chrysostom will always say that this is one of the most difficult tasks of pastoral care, is to diagnose the problem before you address it. So I would say that. I think the larger problem of suffering, and here I would ask people to look at this wonderful book about the theology of illness by Jean-Claude Larcher, who talks about the persistence of suffering in the world just in general as a factor of the reality that all things have not been completed, right? That we have a foretaste of the kingdom in our lives through the sacramental life, through the mystical life of the church, through living at the highest ethical standards. We can purify our lives. And yet, both the just and the unjust still experience the rain that falls from the heavens, right? And that suffering is still part of that. But having said that about why we suffer, right? In every, the prayers that we say for people about to endure an operation, or for people enduring sickness, are that suffering has this educative function for us. Just to go back to something I said before, that all suffering is a form of reminding us, is an exercise in dying, I guess I would say. And a reminder that the things of this world are not ours permanently. This world is not our permanent home, and that we're still waiting for the kingdom to be fully revealed. And so it should cause us to look at our lives, not in a neurotic way where we imagine that every bad thing that happens to us means that we've done some horrible sin, right? We don't want to be neurotic, but we do always want to be checking ourselves and examining our lives, so that whenever we, again, are reminded of the need to be letting go, we can grow in virtue, right? I don't know if I've addressed the question or not, but that's my answer.
There's just a couple of minutes left, and among the wonderful questions and observations that we're getting, several of them deal with the practical and pastoral elements of all this, while respecting all of the sort of analytical dimensions of it, and the idea of the beatific vision that one receives. How does one accompany the suffering patient on the hospital bed? Asks a chaplain, for example, and what are just some of the words that we can draw on from, with all of this knowledge that you both have and are instilling, keeping that on board, but how to sort of translate it in the when the rubber hits the road, those pastoral moments.
Can I say one thing, Dr. Legaspi, real quickly? So when he used the word consolation earlier, that the vision of God is a consolation, and I'm reminded that ancient consolation is about how to endure suffering in a way that where we don't lose our moorings completely. And I think of and for philosophers, it's about how to endure suffering in a philosophical way. For the church fathers who write all kinds of letters of consolation, it's about reminding people of the presence of God and the love of God and of the resurrection in all suffering. And there's a beautiful letter of Saint Basil the Great to a man who's lost a child. And he opens by saying so profoundly, if all the rivers and all the seas turned to tears, there would still be more to weep. So he's there with the person, and he's not trying to beguile them out of their suffering. He's not trying to say that they're not suffering or that they shouldn't suffer, right? But then as the letter goes on, he reminds them that we're saved by a God who knows our suffering, and we're saved by a God who suffered with us. And that although it seems like we're in the darkness, that's where we can find him. I also think of something else now when you mention pastoral issues that I heard at a conference once by a priest who teaches in Balamand named Father Bassam Nassif. Some people might know him. And he was talking about a soldier in the army who was killed, even though he was wearing his cross. And his father, in hysterical agony, stood up in the middle of a church and said, "But Father, my son was wearing his cross. He should not have died. He was wearing his cross." And Father Bassam, the only thing he could think of to say was, "Christ also died on that cross." And that somehow our suffering is taken up in the cross and is brought before God in the cross. And the cross reminds us that God is with those who suffer. right? The strength is, he is in that weakness. And that doesn't always help. I don't know, but somehow it brings some sense that God is not abandoning the sufferer, but is with the sufferer.
And I think that very thing liberates us, right? So
Yeah.
if you want to know how not to do this, read Job, because the friends keep making mistakes. There's a
Oh,
lot
great.
there about how
Yeah.
badly they're doing. And Job says, look, you should be on my side. I know you think X, Y, or Z about what I am doing and who I am, but the job of a friend is to be on the side of the one who's suffering. Be on my side. And in doing so, you will fulfill your mission as friends. So we sometimes think that we have to come in at this angle and like sort of speak down to correct, but we should really just come in right beside. And Job says that's really all that's required of you here. So whatever doctrinal kind of errors are made in the process of them identifying with Job, I think can be more easily forgiven than the errors they make by kind of coming at him from this angle and trying to correct him. But I think we're liberated to do that only because of what you said, Father, and because we have this sort of confidence that we don't have to defend God. I think that's why the friends get in trouble. They think they have to defend him. God doesn't need defending. He doesn't need help, and because he's the one who knows our suffering even better than we know our own. And so, anyway, I think that should liberate us.
Well, those are two great things, that God doesn't need our defending and that we come in as the friend. Those are profound. Yeah, those are really helpful. That's fascinating.
There are so many things in what you said. I was rapt for this hour, and I think our listeners were too, and certainly from the Q&A, that was very evident. Thank you both.